Emily Fortney here. I am ready and excited to give you all some information about a behaviorist, a theorist, a behavior theorist called Jacob Kounin. Let's see here. He did most of his work in the 70s, but he started in 1946, actually, studying behavior theory and classroom management. He called himself a classroom management theorist. And as I said, most of his work became really popular and usable in the 70s. So before he began his studies, most everyone in the education world believed that discipline and instruction were two separate entities, and that you disciplined and you instructed, and they were two separate things, and that they didn't really overlap. And so after Kounin's work and his research and his findings, he worked to integrate teaching and discipline. He actually began his research he went into classrooms and he was trying to research how teachers handled misbehavior. So how they corrected misbehavior, or how they reacted to a student when they misbehaved. So he was trying to look at this reaction to student behavior. But as he kept watching in classrooms and kept researching the subject, he realized that it was more what teachers do from the start, or how they handle their class in general, that controlled behavior. And that was much more important than how a teacher responds to negative behavior. In everything I read about him, he gave this anecdotal story also about how he was teaching this. Basically, this is how he says this shift. He realized this shift, that they're not separate entities, when he was teaching a class one day and he instructed a student to put a newspaper down because the student was reading a newspaper and he couldn't see his face, so he was obviously not listening. So he asked the student to put away the newspaper, and from this direction it helped other students to then begin correct their not appropriate behavior. So others started wrestling to put away notes that they were maybe writing a friend, or something of that nature. So by that one correction, it then caused others to correct their behavior. And he actually coined this the ripple effect. And so he thinks that this is how he kind of made this realization that, wait a second, it's not necessarily how we react to misbehavior, but this idea of what can we do from the beginning that would correct everyone's behavior. One anecdotal thing I found that I think is important to list is as he was studying teachers and what they did to stop misbehavior, he found that it really didn't matter what the teacher did to handle the situation. It wouldn't change the student's reaction. And I think that's really interesting when we think about our classrooms and how we correct student behaviors, and how you have to be really effective in what you do to correct the student behavior, because a lot of the time the reaction of the student will not change. Okay, so to kind of summarize, basically, Kounin is important because he believed this idea of discipline and instruction should overlap. They are not separate entities, and in fact, they go very much hand in hand. And the ways teachers handle misbehavior, once it occurs, this is not the key to successful classroom management. Really what's important is what teachers do to prevent management problems from occurring. So again, what they do to set up their classrooms with good rules and guidelines, and have a consistent environment where students know the expectations and the consequences. Okay, so that's a little bit an overall summary about what his behavior theories are. And now let's look at 5 of his behavior techniques. Let's begin with withedness. This technique is basically a teacher's ability to know what's going on in the classroom at all time, at all times, and to be able to kind of nip problems in the bud because you're so alert and you know what your students are doing and where they are. You know, knowing sights and sounds of the classrooms, having students arranged so that they're in eyesight, constantly scanning to be aware of where students are and what they're doing, whether this be in small groups or if people are at the computer and you're teaching. Yes, this is his idea of withedness. The second technique is overlapping. This is a teacher's ability to deal with more than one thing at a time. So 2 things at a time, or sometimes even 8 things at a time. So I see this kind of as when students are in small groups and maybe you're working with one small group, but you're also paying attention to others at a center and you're able to monitor more than one thing at a time. Of course, this also applies to when someone walks in with a note from the office or when some sort of distraction happens. This idea of overlapping is the teacher's ability to deal with more than one thing at a time. Kounin's third technique is smoothness, and this is the ability to transition smoothly between learning activities. He emphasized the idea of planning thoroughly, so you know what comes next and you know what you need for what comes next, and you have everything ready and prepared, so you're not just frantically searching for your next lesson plan or your next material that you need. Also, he promotes the idea of once students are working and engaged, let them work and don't distract them. Let them be able to accomplish their task. The fourth technique is momentum, and this is the teacher's ability to pace and have steady movement throughout the lesson. I think this kind of applies with making sure your lesson moves quickly, not too quickly so that students are lost, but quickly enough so that no one is bored. You're not dwelling on one specific aspect. You know, even if you have behavior problems, you don't spend 30 minutes figuring out the problem or nagging them, but you quickly return to the lesson and you allow students to move throughout lessons and activities without waiting for others. The final technique is group alerting, which I think is the most fun. So it's this idea of keeping students actively participating, and he kind of coins it in this idea of creating suspense and interest. And some ways you could do this is by calling on students at random, or having students move around physically, so and like showing other students what they're doing, or have the entire class respond in unison, or having like different types of questions so it keeps students alert. So that is the final technique. I hope you've learned a lot about Jacob Kounin and are excited to maybe use some of his strategies in your own classroom. Thanks!